intelligent faces. They're the successful dramatists of 18th century Paris, and their busts stand in the foyer of the French National Theatre. That theatre which for 100 years did so much to promote good sense and humanity. And here is the wittiest and most intelligent of them all, in fact, at a certain level, one of the most intelligent men that have ever lived, Voltaire. He's smiling, the smile of reason. You know, there's a character called Fontenelle, a French philosopher who, by living to be nearly 100, bridged the 17th and 18th centuries, the world of Newton and the world of Voltaire. He held a position known as perpetual secretary of the Academy of Science. He told an interviewer that he had never run and never lost his temper. The interviewer asked him if he had ever laughed. He said, "No, I have never made ha-ha." But he smiled. And so do all the other distinguished writers, philosophers, dramatists, and hostesses of the French 18th century. It seems to us shallow. We've got into deep water in the last 50 years. We feel that people ought to be more passionate, more convinced, or, as the current jargon has it, more committed. The smile of reason may seem to betray a certain incomprehension of the deeper human emotions, but it didn't preclude some strongly held beliefs. Belief in natural law, belief in justice, belief in toleration. Not bad. The philosophers of the Enlightenment pushed European civilization some steps up the hill. And in theory, at any rate, this gain was consolidated throughout the 19th century. Up to the 1930s, people were supposed not to burn witches and other members of minority groups, or extract confessions by torture, or pervert the course of justice, or go to prison for speaking the truth, except, of course, during wars. This we owe to the movement known as the Enlightenment, and above all, to Voltaire. Although the victory of reason and tolerance was won in France, it was initiated in England, and the French philosophers never concealed their debt to the country that, in a score of years, had produced Newton, Locke, and the bloodless revolution. When Voltaire visited England in the 1720s, it had enjoyed a quarter of a century of very vigorous intellectual life. And although Swift, Pope, and Addison might give and receive some hard knocks in print, they weren't physically beaten up by the hired gangs of offended noblemen or sent to prison for satirical references to the establishment. Both these things happened to Voltaire, and as a result, he took refuge in England in 1726. It was the age of the great country houses, and in 1722, the most splendid of all had just been completed for Marlborough. There it is, Blenheim Palace. A superb setting, but not everybody's idea of a pleasant country retreat. When Voltaire saw it, he exclaimed, "What a great heap of stone, without charm or taste." Well, it was built as a monument to military glory, and the architect, Sir John Vanbrugh, was a natural romantic, a castle builder, who didn't care a fig for good taste and classical decorum. '18th century England was the paradise of the amateur. by which I mean men rich enough and grand enough to do whatever they liked, who nevertheless did things that required a good deal of expertise. One of the things they chose to do was architecture. Wren began as a brilliant amateur, and although he made himself into a professional, he retained the amateur's freedom of approach to every problem. And two of his chief successors were amateurs by any definition. Sir John Vanbrugh wrote plays, but he also designed the vast and complicated structure of Blenheim. Lord Burlington was a connoisseur and a collector and arbiter of taste, the sort of character nowadays much despised. But he built this small masterpiece of domestic architecture, Chiswick. One may wonder how many professional architects today could handle these problems of design as expertly as Lord Burlington has done. These steps and colonnades look very imposing, but the building behind them is quite small, about the size of an old parsonage. In fact, Chiswick was not meant for day-to-day existence, but for social occasions, conversation, intrigue, political gossip, and a little music. Of course, it's only a miniature, kind of glorified drill box. Yet I don't feel that it's at all pinched or constricted. In a way, these 18th century amateurs were the inheritors of the Renaissance ideal of universal man. And it's significant that the typical universal man of the Renaissance, Alberti, had also been an architect. If we may still consider architecture to be a social art, an art by which men may be enabled to lead a fuller life, then perhaps the architect should touch life at many points and not be too narrowly specialized. 18th century amateurism ran through everything: chemistry, philosophy, botany and natural history. It produced men like the indefatigable Sir Joseph Banks, who refused to go on Captain Cook's second voyage because he wasn't allowed to have two horn players to make music for him during dinner. There was a freshness and a freedom of mind in these men that is entirely lost in the rigidly controlled classifications of the professional. And they were independent, with all the advantages and disadvantages to society that result from that condition. They wouldn't have fitted in to our modern utopia. I recently heard a professor of sociology say on television, "What's not prohibited must be made compulsory." Not a suggestion that would have attracted those eminent visitors, Voltaire and Rousseau, who drew inspiration from our philosophy and our institutions and our tolerance. But as usual, there was another side to this shining medal. And of this we have an exceptionally vivid record in the work of Hogarth.
The days of me youth I could feel like a dove.
In the days of my youth he could feel like a dove, like a sparrow at all times was ready for love. Little laddie, little laddie, la-la-la-la-la-la-la-la.
The life of all mortals in kissing should pass.
The life of all mortals in kissing should pass. Little lip while you're young. down in the lip of the glass. Hello, little laddie, hello, little laddie, hello, la, 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 la.
Drinking, wenching, stealing. No more than today, I suppose, but rather more openly. All this coarse life is painted with great delicacy, and although Hogarth's compositions are rather a muddle, one can't deny that he had a gift of narrative invention. In later life, he did a series of pictures of an election that are easy to follow and a very convincing comment on the much cracked-up democracy of 18th century England. Here's the polling booth with imbeciles and moribunds being persuaded to make their marks. And an old soldier loyally voting for the establishment with his hook. And here's the successful candidate, like a fat, powdered capon, borne in triumph by his bruisers who are still carrying on their private feuds. And I must confess that Hogarth conquers my prejudice by this blind fiddler, a real stroke of imagination outside the usual range of his moralizing journalism. The truth is, I think, that 18th century England, in the aftermath of its middle-class revolution, had created two societies very remote from one another. One was a society of modest country gentlemen, of which we have a perfect record in the work of a painter called Davis, comically stiff and expressionless in their cold, empty rooms. True, it developed into the world of Jane Austen, which was not lacking in critical intelligence, but was somewhat deficient in energy. The other was the urban society of which Hogarth has left us many records. Plenty of animal spirits, but not what we could call by any stretch civilization. I hope you won't think it too facile if I compare this print, called A Midnight Modern Conversation, with a picture painted in the same decade called A Reading from Molière by the French artist de Troyes. In this series, I've tried to go beyond the narrower meaning of the word civilized, but all the same, it has its value, and one can't deny that this is a picture of civilized life. Even the furniture contrives to be both beautiful and comfortable at the same time. And one reason is that whereas all the characters in Hogarth's Midnight Conversation are male, 5 out of the 7 figures in the de Troyes are women. In talking about the 12th and 13th centuries, I said how great an advance in civilization was achieved by respect for feminine qualities. And the same was true of 18th century France. I think it absolutely essential to civilization that the male and female principles be kept in balance. And I've observed that where at a party men and women hive off into separate groups, the level of civilization declines. In 18th century France, the influence of women was benevolent and, on the whole, creative. And it produced that curious institution of the 18th century, the salon. Those small social gatherings of intelligent men and women drawn from all over Europe, who met in the rooms of gifted hostesses, like Madame du Deffand, were, for 40 years, the centers of European civilization. They were less poetical than the court of Urbino, but intellectually a good deal more alert. The ladies who presided over them were neither very young nor very rich. Here's Madame Geoffrin eating dinner while her servant reads to her. We know exactly what they looked like because French artists at the time have portrayed them without flattery, but with a penetrating eye for their subtlety of mind. How did these ladies do it? Not by beauty or physical charms. They did it by human sympathy, by making people feel at ease, by tact. The success of the Parisian salon also depended on 2 accidental factors. The court and government of France were not situated in Paris, but here in Versailles. It was a separate world. Indeed, the courtiers of Versailles always referred to it as ce pays-ci, this country of ours. And to this day, I enter this huge, unfriendly courtyard with mixed feelings, panic and fatigue, as if I were going into an alien world. But the remoteness of Versailles had this good result, that Parisian society was free from the stultifying rituals of court procedure and the trivial day-to-day preoccupations of politics. The other thing that made 18th century salons a source of enlightenment was that the French upper classes were not destructively rich, as they lost most of their money in a financial crash brought about by a Scottish wizard named David Law. As I've said several times, a margin of wealth is helpful to civilization, but for some mysterious reason, great wealth is destructive. I suppose that some discipline and economy is as necessary in art as it is in life. Also, great display is heartless. The south front of Versailles is a masterpiece of architectural design, but it doesn't touch us like something loved and familiar. For example, look at Chardin, the greatest painter of mid-18th century France. No one has ever had a surer taste in color and design. Every area, every interval, every tone gives one the feeling of perfect rightness. Well, Chardin didn't depict the upper classes, still less the court. He sometimes found his subjects in the thrifty bourgeoisie, and what sweet people they are. Sometimes among the working class, where I think he was happiest because he loved the basic design of pots and barrels. They are noble, in a way that a piece of Louis XV's furniture couldn't be. Chardin's pictures show the qualities immortalized in verse by La Fontaine and Molière: good sense, a good heart, an approach to human relationships both simple and delicate. And they show that these survived into the mid-18th century and survive to this day among skilled workmen, what the French call artisans, who still maintain the character of French civilization. The salons where the brightest intellects of France were assembled were more luxurious, but still not overwhelming. The furniture was in a style that may seem to us rather extravagant, but the rooms were of a normal size. People could feel that they had some human relationship with one another. After the law crash, many of the French upper classes couldn't afford houses in Paris and lived in apartments. Comfort and elegance took the place of grandeur. We have a complete record of how people lived in mid-18th century France, because there were innumerable minor artists who were content to record the contemporary scene instead of expressing themselves. Here's part of a series modestly known as the Monument of Costume, small masterpieces of design and execution. The ladies have come to see their friend who's about to have a baby. Don't be afraid, dear friend, they say. In this painting by Boucher, a lady is dressing by the fire, her maid asking her what she's going to wear. And here, also by Boucher, is the family sitting by the window having their morning coffee, or more likely chocolate. The little girl showing off her toys. Well, nobody but a sourpuss or a hypocrite would deny that this is an agreeable way of life. Why do so many of us instinctively react against it? Because we think it based on exploitation? Do we really think that far? If so, it's like being sorry for animals and not being a vegetarian. Our whole society is based on different sorts of exploitation. Or is it because we believe that this kind of life was shallow and trivial? Well, that simply isn't true. The men who enjoyed it were no fools. Talleyrand said that only those who experienced the life of 18th century France had known the douceur de vivre, the sweetness of living. And Talleyrand was certainly one of the most intelligent men who ever taken up politics. The people who frequented the salons of 18th century France were not merely a group of fashionable good-timers. They were the outstanding philosophers and scientists of the time. They wanted to publish their very revolutionary views on religion. They wanted to curtail the power of a lazy king and an irresponsible government. They wanted to change society. In the end, they got rather more of a change than they bargained for. The men who met each other in the salons of Madame de Deffand and Madame Geoffrin were engaged in a great work. Here it is, an encyclopedia, or Dictionnaire raisonné des sciences, des arts et des métiers. It was intended to advance mankind by conquering ignorance. It was a gigantic enterprise, as you can see. Eventually, this is only a small part of it, eventually there are 24 folio volumes. And of course, it involved a great many contributors. But the dynamo of the whole undertaking was Diderot. There he is, in a picture by Van Loo, smiling the smile of reason, which enraged him. He said he'd been made to look like an old cocotte who was still trying to be agreeable. He was a many-sided man, very intelligent, a novelist, a philosopher, even an art critic, the great supporter of Chardin. And in the encyclopedia, he wrote articles on everything from Aristotle to artificial flowers. The aims of the encyclopedia seem harmless enough to us, but you know, authoritarian governments don't like dictionaries. They live by lies and by bamboozling abstractions, and they can't afford to have words accurately defined. The encyclopedia was twice suppressed, and by its ultimate triumph, the polite reunions in these elegant salons became precursors of revolutionary politics. They were also precursors of science. The illustrated supplement of the encyclopedia is full of pictures of technical processes. Here's one of the plates, for example, showing the polishing of wood. And then another, all the beginning here shows the making of silk for the tapestry, and this is the actual dyeing of the wool for the Gobelin tapestries. And throughout the book, there are extremely interesting examples of the techniques of the day. In the mid-18th century, science was fashionable and romantic, as one can see from this picture by Wright of Derby. The experiment with the air pump brings us to the new age of scientific invention. The natural philosopher, with his long hair and dedicated stare, perhaps a trifle theatrical, but the other characters are awfully well observed. The little girls who can't bear to witness the death of the poor pigeon, the sensible middle-aged man who tells them that such sacrifices must be made in the interest of science, and the thoughtful man on the right who is wondering if this kind of experiment is really going to do mankind much good. They're all taking it quite seriously, but nonetheless science was, to some extent, an after-dinner occupation like playing the piano in the next century. Even Voltaire, who spent a vast amount of time on weighing molten metal and cutting up worms, was only a dilettante. He lacked the patient realism of the experimenter, and perhaps such tenacity exists only in a milieu where quick-wittedness is less highly valued. In the 18th century, it emerged in a country where civilization still had the energy of newness, Scotland.
Will ye go to Sheriff Muir, Bold John Owen is steer, there to see the noble Mar and his Hieland laddies, o' the true men o' the north, Angus Huntley and Seaforth, scouring on to cross the Forth with their white cockaddies. There you'll see the banners flare, there you'll hear the bagpipes rare, and the trumpets deadly blare, wi' the cannons rattle. There you'll see the bold Macraws, Camerons and Clanranald's raws, o' the clans wi' loud huzzas rushing to the battle.
The Scottish character, and I'm a Scot myself, shows an extraordinary combination of realism and reckless sentiment. The sentiment has passed into popular legend, and the Scots are proud of it, and no wonder. Where but in Edinburgh does a romantic landscape come right into the centre of the town? But it's the realism that counts, and that made 18th century Scotland a poor, remote, semi-barbarous country, a force in European civilization. Let me name some 18th century Scots. In the world of ideas and science, Adam Smith, David Hume, Joseph Black, and James Watt. It's a matter of historical fact that these were the men who, soon after the year 1760, changed the whole current of European thought and life. Joseph Black and James Watt discovered that heat, in particular steam, could be a source of power. Well, I needn't describe how that has changed the world. In The Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith invented the study of political economy and created a social science that lasted up to the time of Karl Marx. In his treatise on human nature, Hume succeeded in proving that experience and reason have no necessary connection with one another, that there's no such thing as a rational belief. Hume, as he himself said, was of an open, social, and cheerful humor, and he was much beloved by the ladies in the Paris salons. I suppose they've never read that small book which has made all philosophers feel uneasy till the present day. All these great Scots lived in the grim, narrow tenements of the old town of Edinburgh, piled on the hill behind the castle. But even in their lifetime, the great Scottish architects, the brothers Adam, who had produced one of the finest pieces of town planning in Europe, the new town of Edinburgh. In addition, they exploited, I think one may almost say invented, the strict, pure classicism that was to influence architecture all over Europe. In fact, another Scot named Cameron took it to Russia with tremendous effect. And then, a Scot having popularized neoclassicism, Sir Walter Scott popularized the Gothic Middle Ages and furnished the imagination of the romantically minded for a century. Not bad for a poor, underpopulated country. Through the practical genius of the Scots and English, those technical diagrams in the encyclopedia became a reality. And before the political revolutions of America and France had taken effect, a far deeper and more durable transformation was already underway, what we call the Industrial Revolution. Wright of Derby, whose imagination had been stirred by the scientific exercises of the intellectuals, was also moved by their first commercial application, and he painted this picture of Arkwright's mill at Crumford. He's felt the romance of industrialism as it begins to usurp the power of the old regime. If, on the practical side, we had to visit Scotland, on the moral side, we must return to France. Not to Paris, but to the borders of Switzerland. Because it was there, a mile or two from the French frontier, that Voltaire made his home. After several bad experiences, he'd become suspicious of authority, and he liked to live in a place where he could easily slip over the border. He didn't suffer from his exile. He'd made a lot of money by speculation. And his last bolt hole, the Chateau of Ferney, is, as you see, a large, agreeable country house. Voltaire built the wings at either end. He also planted this alleyway of beeches for a cool promenade on a hot day. When he was visited by the self-important ladies of Geneva, he would receive them seated on a bench at the far end, down there behind me. It amused him to see how they struggled to prevent their towering powdered wigs from getting entangled in the branches. Well, it's grown up a good deal since then. was in this room that he thought up devastating witticisms with which to destroy his enemies. He may even have done so in this very chair, one of a set with the covers worked by his niece, Madame Denis. I wish I could convey the quality of his wit to you, but Voltaire is one of those writers whose virtue is inseparable from his style, and true style is untranslatable. He himself said, "One word in the wrong place will ruin the most beautiful thought." Still more would it ruin the wit and irony which were his peculiar gifts. To the end of his life he couldn't resist a joke, but on one subject he was completely serious: justice. Many people in his lifetime and since have compared him to a monkey, but when he came to fighting injustice, he was a bulldog. He never let go. He pestered all his friends, he wrote an unending stream of pamphlets, and finally he had some of the victims, like these members of a Protestant family named Calas, who had been cruelly persecuted in Bordeaux, living at his expense at Ferney. Gradually the world ceased to think of him as an impudent libertine, but as a patriarch and sage. And by 1778, he at last felt it safe to return to Paris. He was 84. No victorious general, no lone flyer has ever been given such a reception. He was hailed as the universal man and the friend of mankind. People of all classes crowded round his house, drew his carriage, mobbed him wherever he went. Finally, his bust was crowned on the stage of the Théâtre Français. Naturally, it killed him, but he died triumphant. The remarkable thing about the frivolous 18th century was its seriousness. It was, in many ways, the heir to Renaissance humanism, but there was a vital difference. The Renaissance had taken place within the framework of the Christian Church. A few humanists had showed signs of skepticism, but no one had expressed doubts about the Christian religion as a whole. People had the comfortable moral freedom that goes with an unquestioned faith. But by the middle of the 18th century, serious-minded men could see that the church had become a tied house, tied to property and status, and defending its interests by repressions and injustice. No one felt this more strongly than Voltaire. Écraser l'infâme, crush the vermin. It dominated his later life, and he bequeathed it to his followers. I remember H.G. Wells, who was a kind of 20th century Voltaire, saying that he daren't drive a car in France because the temptation to run over a priest would be too strong for him. All the same, Voltaire remained a kind of believer. He even built a chapel at Ferney. Over the door he had inscribed the words Deo erexit Voltaire, Voltaire in larger letters. It was an affair solely between him and God. However, several of the contributors to the encyclopedia were total materialists. And so the late 18th century was faced with the troublesome task of constructing a new morality without revelation or Christian sanctions. This morality was built on two foundations. One of them was the doctrine of natural law, the other the stoic morality of ancient Republican Rome. Republican virtue inspired the most gifted painter of his day, David. In the Lives of Plutarch, people read about those grim, puritanical heroes of the Roman Republic who sacrificed themselves and their families in the interests of the state. And they took these monsters as models for a new political order. Here's David's first great revolutionary picture, The Oath of the Horatii. It was painted in 1785, and it created an effect which those of us who remember the first appearance of Picasso's Guernica may be able faintly to imagine. The Oath of the Horatii is the supreme picture of revolutionary action, not only in its subject, but in its treatment. Gone are all the melting outlines and pools of senseless shadow of a Fragonard, and in their place are these firmly outlined expressions of will. The unified totalitarian gesture of the brothers, like the kinetic image of a rotating wheel, has an almost hypnotic quality. Even the architecture is a conscious revolt against the refined ornamental style of the time. These Tuscan columns assert the superior virtue of the plain man. 2 years later, David painted an even more grimly Plutarchian picture, the lictors bringing back to the house of Brutus the bodies of his 2 sons whom he had condemned to death for treachery. One of those incidents in Roman history that don't appeal to us, but which was horribly acceptable to French feeling on the eve of the Revolution. One sees how completely the douceur de vivre had lost its hold on the European imagination even before 1789. In fact, the new morality had already guided a revolution outside Europe. Once more, we must leave the ancient focus of civilization and travel to the edge of the civilized world, America. For it was in this virgin soil and not in the compost heap of Europe that the aims of the encyclopedia were first realized. In the 18th century, no white man, except hunters, had penetrated beyond that range of hills. But here, on the border territory of the Indian, the trapper, the buffalo, a young Virginian lawyer elected to build his home in the 1760s. His name was Thomas Jefferson, and he called his house Monticello, the Little Mountain. It must have been an extraordinary apparition in that wild landscape. Jefferson made it up out of the book of the great Renaissance architect Palladio, of which he is said to have owned the only copy in America. But of course, he had to invent a great deal of it himself, and he was highly inventive. The interior of the house betrays the obstinate ingenuity of a creative man who is determined to work out everything for himself. This is his idea for a bed placed between 2 rooms in the wall, so that he could get out either side, either into his study or his sitting room. And to dress, he went up this little circular stair to the room above. And this was his own design for spectacles in a little box the size of a patch box. They look a little small, but in fact you can read by them perfectly well, and with them I can read his own edition of Vitruvius, the classical architect who inspired so much of his building. It's placed on a table, a revolving table, which he designed himself, which works very well, and a revolving chair. Everything in the room he designed, the drapes, the moldings, every single thing. And it all has a kind of simple, homespun, independent air, which is the stamp of Jefferson. He was the typical universal man of the 18th century. Linguist, scientist, agriculturalist, educator, town planner, and architect. Almost every incarnation of Leon Battista Alberti, the universal man of the Renaissance. Even down to a love of music and the management of horses and a certain crankiness. What in a lesser man could have been called a touch of self-righteousness. What a willful, independent head. Of course, Jefferson wasn't as good an architect as Alberti, but then he was also President of the United States. And as an architect, he was by no means bad. Monticello was the beginning of that simple, almost rustic classicism that stretches right up the eastern seaboard of America, right up to Massachusetts, and lasted for 100 years, producing a body of simple, civilized, domestic architecture equal to any in the world. And it reflects the grave self-assurance of the founders of the American Republic. Jefferson is buried in the grounds of Monticello. He left instructions for his tomb On it were to be inscribed the following sentences, and not a word more. Here was buried Thomas Jefferson, author of the Declaration of American Independence, of the Statute of Virginia for Religious Freedom, and father of the University of Virginia. Well, the establishment of religious freedom that earned him so much hatred and abuse in his own day, we now take for granted. But the University of Virginia is still a surprise. It was all designed by Jefferson, and it's full of his character. He called it an academical village. There are 10 pavilions for 10 professors, and between them, behind this colonnade, the rooms of the students, all within reach and yet all individual. The ideal of corporate humanism. And then outside the courtyard are small gardens that show his love of privacy. Those serpentine walls were Jefferson's speciality. Nobody knows where he got them from. Needless to say, they had a practical as well as an aesthetic intention. The great courtyard was round 3 sides of a rectangle. The 4th side you saw over the mountains to Indian territory. How confidently in their semi-wild domain the founding fathers of America assumed the mantle of republican virtue and put into practice the notions of the French Enlightenment. They even called on the great sculptor of the Enlightenment, Houdon, to commemorate their victorious General Washington. And here's the result, standing in the Capitol at Richmond, Virginia. This program began with Houdon's statue of Voltaire, smiling the smile of reason. It could end with Houdon's statue of Washington. No more smiles. Houdon saw his subject as that favorite Roman Republican hero, the decent country gentleman called away from his farm to defend his neighbor's liberties. In fact, the War of Independence lasted 6 years, and at the end of it, the British totally withdrew their forces, and the new republic was born. Washington retired to his farm at Mount Vernon. The ideas of the French Enlightenment influenced the founders of the American Constitution, and in return, the success of the American Rebellion played a part in inspiring the French to overthrow their monarchy. After the storming of the Bastille, Lafayette sent the key of that infamous prison as a present to Washington. Washington hung it in the hall at Mount Vernon, and there it has stayed ever since. By this date, Washington had little time to spend at his home farm on the banks of the Potomac. He had been elected first President of the United States. His monument dominates the new capital city, which was named after him. Facing it, across the tidal basin of the Potomac, is the monument to Jefferson, who became the 3rd president. Not only the Palladian architecture, but the music has crossed the Atlantic. God Save the King has become My Country 'Tis of Thee. On the inner walls are quotations from Jefferson's writings. First, the familiar, noble, indestructible words of the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. Self-evident truths. That's the voice of 18th century Enlightenment. But on the opposite wall are less familiar words by Jefferson that still give us pause today. I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just, that his justice cannot sleep forever. Commerce between master and slave is despotism. Nothing is more certainly written in the book of fate than that these people are to be free. A peaceful-looking scene, a great ideal made visible, but beyond it, what problems? Almost insoluble, or at least not soluble by the smile of reason. For almost 1,000 years, the chief creative force in Western civilization was Christianity. Then, early in the 18th century, it suddenly declined. In intellectual society, it practically disappeared. of course, it left a vacuum. People couldn't get on without a belief in something outside themselves. And during the next 100 years, they concocted a new belief, which, however irrational it may seem to us, has added a good deal to our civilization, a belief in the divinity of nature. Well, it's said that one can attach 52 different meanings to the word nature. In the early 18th century, it had come to mean little more than common sense, as when in conversation we say, but naturally. But the evidences of divine power which took the place of Christianity were manifestations of what we still mean by nature, those parts of the visible world which were not created by man and can be perceived through the senses. Now, this particular change in the direction of the human mind was very largely achieved in England. And I suppose it's no accident that England was the first country in which the Christian faith had collapsed. In about 1730, the French philosopher Montesquieu noted, "There is no religion in England. If anyone mentions religion, people begin to laugh." Montesquieu saw only the ruins of religion, and although he was a very intelligent man, he couldn't have foreseen that these ruins were part of the subtle way in which faith in divine power was to trickle back into the Western European mind. The ruins of the age of faith had become a part of nature, or rather they had become a sort of lead-in to nature through sentiment and memory. They helped to evoke that curious frame of mind which, in the early 18th century, was the usual prelude to the enjoyment of natural beauty, a gentle melancholy. Beautiful poetry was inspired by that mood. Listen to Collins's Ode to Evening.
Then lead, calm votaress, where some sheety lake cheers the lone heath, or some time-hallowed pile, or upland fallows grey, reflect its last cool gleam. Or if chill blustering winds or driving rain prevent my willing feet, be mine the hush that from the mountain's side views wilds and swelling floods, and hamlets brown and dim discovered spires, and hears their simple bell, and marks o'er all thy dewy fingers draw the gradual dusky veil.
Very beautiful, but not very like nature, any more than were the pictures of Gainsborough and Cousins which accompanied it. The author of that poem, William Collins, isn't a familiar name outside England, and the same is true of all the 18th century English nature poets, even James Thomson, who was in his day the most famous poet in Europe. An emotional response to nature is one of the few extensions of our faculties that don't go back to an individual of genius. It first appears in minor poets and provincial painters, and even in fashions. For example, the fashion that took the straight avenues of formal gardens and changed them into twisting paths with pseudo-natural prospects, what were known all over Europe for 100 years as English gardens. Perhaps the most pervasive influence that England has ever had on the look of things in Europe, except for men's fashions in the early 19th century. Trivial? Well, I suppose that all fashions seem trivial, but are serious. When Pope described this scene of man as a mighty maze of walks without a plan, he was expressing a profound change in the European mind. So much for nature in the first half of the 18th century. Then, in about the year 1760, this English prelude of melancholy minor poets and picturesque gardens touched the mind of a man of genius, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. His name involves a change of scene, because although to some extent he derived his love of nature from England, it was among the lakes and alpine valleys of Switzerland that his absorption in nature first became a mystical experience. For over 2,000 years, mountains have been considered simply a nuisance, unproductive, obstacle to communication, the refuge of bandits and heretics. It's true that in about 1340, the poet Petrarch had climbed one and enjoyed the view at the top, and then been put to shame by a passage from St. Augustine. And at the beginning of the 16th century, Leonardo da Vinci had wandered about in the Alps, ostensibly to study botany and geology, but his landscape background showed that he was moved by what he saw. No other mountain climbs are recorded. And to Erasmus, Montaigne, Descartes, Newton, practically any of the great civilizers I have mentioned in these programs, the thought of climbing a mountain for pleasure would have seemed ridiculous. Perhaps I should add that this is not altogether true of the painters. For example, Peter Bruegel, on his way from Antwerp to Rome in 1552, made drawings of the Alps, which show something more than a topographical interest, and were later used in his paintings. However, the fact remains that when an ordinary traveller of the 16th and 17th centuries crossed the Alps, it never occurred to him to admire the scenery, until the year 1739, when the poet Thomas Gray, visiting the Grand Chartreuse, wrote in a letter, "Not a precipice, not a torrent, not a cliff, but is pregnant with religion and poetry." Amazing. Might have been written by Ruskin. In fact, I don't think that the full force of Alpine poetry was expressed till the time of Byron and Turner. But in the middle of the 18th century, a good many people seem to have recognized the charm of the Swiss lakes and enjoyed them in a comfortable, dilettantish sort of way. There even arose a Swiss tourist industry that supplied travelers in search of the picturesque with mementos and produced one remarkable, almost forgotten artist, Caspar Wolff, who anticipated Turner by, 30 years. But like the 18th century English nature poets, this is a provincial overture, which might never have become a part of contemporary thought without the genius of Rousseau. Whatever his defects as a human being, and they were clearly apparent to all those who tried to befriend him, Rousseau was a genius, one of the most original minds of any age, and a writer of incomparable prose. His solitary and suspicious character had this advantage, that it made him an outsider. He didn't care what he said. As a result, he was persecuted. For half his life, he was hounded out of one country after another. In 1765, he seemed safely established in a small principality, Motier, but the local parson stirred up the people against him, and they stoned him. They broke his windows. He took refuge on this island in the Lake of Bienne. And there he had an experience so intense that one could almost say it caused a revolution in human feeling. In listening to the flux and reflux of these waves, he tells us, he became completely at one with nature. He lost all consciousness of an independent self, all painful memories of the past or anxieties about the future, everything except the sense of being. I realized, he said, that our existence is nothing but a succession of moments perceived through the senses. I feel, therefore I am. A curious discovery to have been made in the middle of the Age of Reason, but a few years earlier the Scottish philosopher Hume had reached the same conclusion by logical means. It was an intellectual time bomb which, after sizzling away for almost 200 years, has only just gone off. Whether to the advantage of civilization now seems rather doubtful. It had a certain effect in the 18th century and became part of the new cult of sensibility. But no one seems to have realized how far abandonment to sensation might take us, or what a questionable divinity nature might prove to be. No one except the Marquis de Sade, who saw through the new god or goddess from the start. Nature averse to crime, he said. I tell you that nature lives and breathes by it, hungers at all her pores for bloodshed, yearns with all her heart for the furtherance of cruelty. Well, the Marquis was what used to be called a rank outsider, and his unfavourable view of nature is hardly mentioned in the 18th century. On the contrary, Rousseau's belief in the beauty and innocence of nature was extended from plants and trees and so forth to man. He believed that natural man was virtuous. It was partly a survival of the old myth of the Golden Age, partly a feeling of shame at the corruption of European society. But Rousseau gave it a theoretical basis in a work entitled A Discourse on the Origin of Inequality Among Men. He sent a copy to Voltaire, who replied in a letter which is a famous example of Voltairean wit. No one, he said, has ever used so much intelligence to persuade us to be stupid. After reading your book, one feels one ought to walk on all fours. Unfortunately, during the last 60 years, I have lost the habit. It was a dialectical triumph, but no more, because belief in the superiority of natural man became one of the motive powers of the next half-century. And less than 20 years after Rousseau had propounded his theory, it seemed to have been confirmed by fact. The French explorer Bougainville discovered Tahiti, and 2 years later, Captain Cook stayed there for 4 months in order to observe the transit of Venus. Well, Bougainville was a student of Rousseau, and it isn't surprising that he should have found in the Tahitians all the qualities of the noble savage. But Captain Cook was a hard-headed Yorkshireman, and even he couldn't help comparing the happy and harmonious life that he had discovered in Tahiti with the squalor and brutality of Europe. And soon, the brightest wits of Paris and London were beginning to ask whether the word civilization was not more appropriate to the uncorrupted islanders of the South Seas than to the exceptionally corrupt society of 18th century Europe. You may remember that some such idea was put to Dr. Johnson by a gentleman who expatiated to him on the happiness of savage life. Do not allow yourself to be imposed on by such gross absurdities, said Dr. Johnson. It is sad stuff. If a bull could speak, he might as well exclaim, "Here am I with this cow and this grass. What being can enjoy greater felicity?" Well, without going as far as Dr. Johnson, who had momentarily forgotten the attribute of soul, the student of European civilization may observe that Polynesia produced no Dante, Michelangelo, Shakespeare, Newton, Goethe, what have you. And although we may all agree that the impact of European civilization on places like Tahiti was disastrous, we must also allow that the very fragility of those Arcadian societies, the speed and completeness with which they collapsed on the peaceful appearance of a few British sailors, followed by a handful of missionaries, shows that they were not civilizations in the sense of that word which I have been using. Although the worship of nature had its dangers, the prophets of the new religion were earnest and even pious men whose whole aim was to prove that their goddess was respectable and even moral. And they achieved this by the curious intellectual feat of approximating nature and truth. Far the greatest man to apply his mind to this feat was the poet Goethe. The word nature appears throughout his writings on almost every page of his theoretical and critical writings, and is claimed as the ultimate sanction for all his judgments. It's true that Goethe's nature is slightly different from Rousseau's nature. He meant by it not how things seem, but how things work if they are not interfered with. He saw all the living things, and he was a distinguished botanist who made his own drawings of the plants he observed. He saw everything as striving for fuller development through an infinitely long process of adaptation. I might almost say that he believed in the gradual civilization of plants and animals. It was the point of view that was later to lead to Darwin and the theory of evolution. But this analytic and philosophic approach to nature had less immediate effect on people's minds than the purely inspirational approach of the English Romantic poets Coleridge and Wordsworth. Difficult to illustrate this rather Germanic state of mind by an English picture. The ones before you are by the great German landscape painter Caspar David Friedrich. Coleridge looked at nature in the high, mystical manner. This is how he addressed the Swiss mountains in his Hymn Before Sunrise, the Vale of Chamonix.
O dread and silent mount, I gazed upon thee till thou, still present to the bodily sense, didst vanish from my thought. Entranced in prayer, I worshipped the invisible alone.
Wordsworth's approach to nature was religious in the moral Anglican manner. Accuse me not, he said, of arrogance, if having walked with nature and offered, as far as frailty would allow, my heart a daily sacrifice to truth, I now affirm of nature and of truth that their divinity revolts, offended at the ways of men. Well, that nature should be shocked by human behavior, it does seem to us rather nonsense. But one mustn't lightly accuse Wordsworth of arrogance or silliness. By the time he wrote those lines, he had lived through a great deal. As a young man, he went to France, lived with a spirited French girl, and had a daughter, and became involved with the French Revolution, an ardent Girondist. But for a chance, he might easily have had his head chopped off in the September massacres. He returned to England, disgusted with the political aspect of the revolution, but not the less attached to its ideals. And he set out to describe in verse the truth about the hardships of poor people, as they had never been described before. He wrote poems without a glimmer of comfort or hope. He walked for miles alone on Salisbury Plain and in Wales, talking only to tramps and beggars and discharged prisoners. He was utterly crushed by man's inhumanity to man. And finally, he came to Tintern. The abbey is in the valley behind me there. Of course, he'd always been observant of natural beauty. His earliest poem shows that. But in August 1793, like Rousseau on the island of Saint-Pierre, he recognized that only total absorption in nature could heal and restore his spirit. He returned to Tintern 5 years later and recaptured some of those first feelings.
Though changed, no doubt, from what I was when first I came among these hills, when like a roe I bounded o'er the mountains, by the sides of the deep rivers and the lonely streams, wherever nature led, more like a man flying from something that he dreads than one who sought the thing he loved. For nature then to me was all in all. I cannot paint what then I was. The sounding cataract haunted me like a passion. The tall rock, the mountain, and the deep and gloomy wood, their colors and their forms, were then to me an appetite, a feeling and a love that had no need of a remoter charm by thought supplied, or any interest unborrowed from the eye.
Unlike many of his successors in the 19th century, Wordsworth had earned the right to lose himself in nature. So, after all, Rousseau, because the author of The Solitary Walker was also the author of The Social Contract, the Gospel of Revolution. A sympathy with the humble, the voiceless, be they human or animal, does seem to be a necessary accompaniment to the worship of nature, and has been ever since St. Francis. Robert Burns, at the first dawn of romantic poetry, would not have written "A man's a man for a' that" if he hadn't also felt deeply distressed at disturbing a field mouse's nest. The new religion was anti-hierarchical. It proposed a new set of values, and this was implied in Wordsworth's belief that it was based on right instincts rather than on learning. It was an extension of Rousseau's discovery of immediate feeling, but with the addition of the word moral, because Wordsworth recognized that simple people and animals often show more courage and loyalty and unselfishness than sophisticated people. Also, a greater sense of the wholeness of life. One impulse from a vernal wood may teach you more of man, of moral evil and of good, than all the sages can. What was it that made Wordsworth turn from man to nature? It was the reappearance in his life of his sister Dorothy. They first set up house together in Somerset, then, driven by a strong instinct, they returned to their native country and settled in this cottage at Grasmere. It was in this garden and in the tiny sitting room that Wordsworth wrote his most inspired poems. The journal which Dorothy kept in these years shows how often his poems originated in one of her vivid experiences, and Wordsworth knew it. She gave me eyes, she gave me ears, and humble cares and delicate fears. In the new religion of nature, this shy, unassuming woman was the saint and prophetess. Unfortunately, the feelings for each other of brother and sister were too strong for the usages of this world. Thou, my dearest friend, my dear, dear friend, and in thy voice I catch the language of my former heart, and read my former pleasures in the shooting lights of thy wild eyes. Oh, yet a little while may I behold in thee what I was once, my dear, dear sister, and this prayer I make, knowing that nature never did betray the heart that loved her. The burning heat of romantic egotism. Both Byron and Wordsworth fell deeply in love with their sisters. The inevitable prohibition was a disaster for both of them, and Wordsworth suffered most because although Byron became restless and cynical, he did write Don Juan, whereas Wordsworth, after the heartbreaking renunciation of Dorothy, gradually lost inspiration, and although quite happily married to an old school friend, wrote less and less poetry than one can read without an effort. And Dorothy became simple-minded. So far, I've illustrated Wordsworth's poems and ideas from the camera's view of nature. But at the same moment that English poetry took its revolutionary course, English painting also produced two men of genius, Turner and Constable. A few months before Wordsworth had settled in the Lake District, Turner had painted this picture of Buttermere. Turner, for all his love of the spectacular, was capable all his life of total surrender to a visual impression. What could be more Wordsworthian than the humble passivity with which he's immersed himself in this quite ordinary scene? However, Wordsworth's real kinship was not with Turner, but with Constable. They both were countrymen with strong appetites rigidly controlled. They both grasped nature with the same physical passion. I have seen him, said Constable's biographer, admire a fine tree with an ecstasy like that with which he would catch up a beautiful child in his arms. Constable never had the least doubt that nature meant the visible world of tree, flower, river, field and sky, exactly as they presented themselves to the senses. And he seems to have arrived intuitively at Wordsworth's belief that by dwelling with absolute truth on natural objects, he would reveal something of the moral grandeur of the universe. Only by concentrating on the shining, variable surface of appearance would he discover that motion and the spirit that impels all thinking things, all objects of all thoughts, and rolls through all things. Then both Wordsworth and Constable loved their own places, and never tired of those things which had entered their imaginations as children. Constable said, "The sound of water escaping from mill dams, old rotten planks, shiny posts and brickwork, these scenes made me a painter, and I am grateful." We've got so used to this approach to painting that it is difficult for us to see how strange it was, at a time when all serious artists aspire to go to Rome, for anyone to love shiny posts and rotten planks more than heroes in armour. Constable hated grandeur and pomposity, and like Wordsworth, his cult of simplicity sometimes seems to me to go too far. This cottage in a cornfield perhaps isn't quite interesting enough. A constable like this is the forerunner of a quantity of commonplace painting, just as Wordsworth's poems on small celandines and so forth anticipated a quantity of bad poetry. It was rejected from the Academy when it was painted. "Take away that nasty green thing," they said. But for 100 years it would have been one of his works most likely to be accepted. When Constable really trusted his emotions, his rustic subjects do achieve that quality by which, as Wordsworth said, the passions of men are incorporated with the beautiful and permanent forms of nature. In such a picture as The Leaping Horse, the classically simple structure of the lock, the weight of water, the movement of the barges, they're all expressive of man's dignity and determination, just as the sky and agitated trees are expressive of his emotional struggles. The simple life. It was a necessary part of the new religion of nature, and one in strong contrast to earlier aspirations. Civilization, which for so long had been dependent on great monasteries or palaces or well-furnished salons, could now emanate from a cottage. Even Goethe at the court of Weimar preferred to live in a small and simple garden house. And Dove Cottage was extremely humble and remote. No carriages rolled up to that door. Which reminds me of how closely the worship of nature was connected with walking. In the 18th century, a solitary walker was viewed with almost as much disapproval as he is in Los Angeles today. But the Wordsworths walked continually. De Quincey calculated that by middle age the poet had walked 180,000 miles. Even the unathletic Coleridge walked. They thought nothing of walking 16 miles after dinner to post a letter. And so, for over 100 years, going for a walk was the spiritual as well as the physical exercise of all intellectuals, poets and philosophers. I'm told that in universities the afternoon walk is no longer part of the intellectual life. but for a quantity of people, walking is still one of the chief escapes from the pressures of the material world. And the countryside where Wordsworth walked in solitude is now crowded with pilgrims as lured or Benares. The resemblances of Wordsworth to Constable, which seem so obvious to us, didn't occur to their contemporaries, partly, I suppose, because Constable was hardly known till 1825, by which time, alas, Wordsworth had become a priggish old bore, and partly because Constable painted flat country, whereas Wordsworth, and indeed the whole cult of nature, was associated with mountains. This, combined with Constable's lack of finish, was what led Ruskin to underrate him, while devoting a good part of his life to the praise of Turner. Turner was the supreme exponent of that response to nature felt by Gray in the Grande Chartreuse, what one might call the picturesque sublime. I suppose that the new religion required assertions of power and sublimity more obvious than those provided by daisies and celandines. But don't think that I am trying to belittle Turner. He was a genius of the first order, far the greatest painter that England has ever produced. And although he was prepared to work in the fashionable style with plentiful exaggerations, he never lost his intuitive understanding of nature. No one has ever known more about natural appearances, and he was able to fit into this encyclopedic knowledge memories of the most fleeting effects of light, sunrises, passing storms, dissolving mists, none of which had ever been set on canvas before. For 30 years, these brilliant gifts were exploited in a series of pictures which dazzled his contemporaries, but are perhaps too artificial for modern taste. All the time, Turner was perfecting, for his own private satisfaction, an entirely new approach to painting, which really was only recognized in our own day. It consisted of transforming everything into pure color. Light rendered as color, feelings about life rendered as color. You know, it's quite difficult for us to realize what a revolutionary procedure this was. One has got to remember that for centuries objects were thought to be real because they were solid. You proved their reality by touching or tapping them. People still do. And all respectable art aimed at defining this solidity, either by modelling or by a firm outline. What is it, said Blake, that distinguishes honesty from knavery, but the hard and wary line of rectitude? Colour was considered immoral, perhaps rightly, because it is an immediate sensation, and it makes its effect independently of those ordered memories that are the basis of morality. However, Turner's colour was not at all arbitrary, what we call decorative colour. However magical it seems, it always started as the record of an actual experience. Turner, like Rousseau, used his optical sensations to discover the truth. I feel, therefore I am. It's a fact which you can verify by looking at the Turners in the Tate Gallery, that the less defined, the more purely coloristic they are, the more vividly they convey a total sense of truth to nature. Turner declared the independence of colour, and thereby added a new faculty to the human mind. I don't suppose that Turner was conscious of his relationship with Rousseau, but the other great prophet of nature, Goethe, meant a lot to him. Although he had had practically no education, he painfully read Goethe's works, in particular his theory of colour, and he sympathized with Goethe's feeling for nature as an organism, as something that works according to certain laws. This, of course, was one of the things about Turner that delighted Ruskin, so that his enormous defence of the artist, which he called by the wholly misleading title of Modern Painters, became an encyclopedia of natural observation. Just as the Middle Ages produced encyclopedias in which inaccurate observations were used to prove the truth of the Christian religion, so Ruskin accumulated very accurate observations of plants, rocks, clouds, mountains, in order to prove that nature worked according to law. Well, we can't believe in Ruskin's moral law, but when he says, "The power which causes the several portions of a plant to help each other, we call life. Intensity of life is also intensity of helpfulness. The ceasing of this help is what we call corruption." He does seem to me to have drawn from his observations a moral at least as convincing as most of those that can be drawn from Holy Writ. And it helps to explain why for 50 years after the publication of Modern Painters, Ruskin was considered one of the chief prophets of his time. All these aspects of the new religion of nature meet and mingle where the old religions had also focused their aspirations, the sky. Only instead of the influential movements of the planets or the vision of the celestial city, the nature worshippers concentrated on the clouds. But clouds are very difficult to deal with intellectually. They're proverbially lawless. Even Ruskin gave up the attempt in despair. So for the time being, this sky appealed less to the analytically minded than to those worshippers of nature who abandoned themselves to Rousseau's sensuous reverie. The whole mind, said an early writer on Romanticism, may become at length something like a hemisphere of cloud scenery, filled with an ever-moving train of changing, melting forms. Wordsworth put it even better in a famous passage in the first book of the Excursion.
Far and wide the clouds were touched, and in their silent faces could he read unutterable love. Sound needed none, nor any voice of joy. His spirit drank the spectacle. Sensation, soul, and form all melted into him. They swallowed up his animal being. In them did he live, and by them did he live. They were his life.
Constable said that in landscape painting, clouds are the chief organ of sentiment. He did hundreds of cloud studies, noting on the back the month, the time of the day, the direction of the wind. Ruskin said, "I bottled clouds as carefully as my father, who was a wine merchant, had bottled sherries." And for Turner, they had a symbolic meaning. He identified skies of peace and skies of discord. Clouds the color of blood become symbols of destruction. His chief aim in life was to see the sun rise above water. He owned a number of houses from which he could see this happening, and he was particularly fascinated by the line where the sky and the sea join each other, that mingling of the elements which seems, by its harmony of tone, to lead to a general reconciliation of opposites. In order to observe these effects, the sea, the sky, and the point where they join, Turner lived by the seaside in East Kent, believed by the neighbours to be an eccentric sea captain called Puggy Booth, who, even in retirement, could not stop looking out to sea. A dialogue between the sea and the sky. Well, it's no accident that the accompaniment of those Turner sea pieces was Debussy's La Mer, written, 80 years later. Turner was the first great artist to paint absolutely outside his own time. Pictures like this have no relation to anything that was being done in Europe or was to be done for almost a century. In 1840, they must have looked as incomprehensible as the works of Jackson Pollock a century later. The enraptured vision that first induced Rousseau to live in the world of sensation had one more triumph in the 19th century. Curiously enough, it also came from looking at ripples, the sun sparkling on water, or the quavering reflections of masts. And it took place in 1869 when Monet and Renoir used to meet at a riverside cafe called La Grenouillère. Before that meeting, they'd both followed the ordinary naturalist style. But when they came to those ripples and reflections, patient naturalism was defeated. All one could do was to give an impression. An impression of what? Of light, because that's all we see. It was a long time since the philosopher Hume had come to the same conclusion. And at that time, the Impressionists had no idea that they were following up a philosophical theory. But the fact remains that Monet's words, light is the principal person in the picture, gave a kind of philosophic unity to their work, so that the great years of Impressionism have added something to our human faculties, as well as delighting our eyes. Our awareness of light has become part of that general awareness, so marvelously described in the novels of Proust, which seemed, when we first read them, almost to give us a new sense. When one thinks of how many beautiful Impressionist pictures there are in the world, and what a difference they've made to our way of seeing, it is surprising how short a time the movement, as a movement, lasted. We know the periods in which men can work together happily, inspired by a single aim, last only a short time. It's one of the tragedies of civilization. After 20 years, the Impressionist movement had split up. One party thought that light should be rendered scientifically in touches of primary color, as if it had passed through a spectrum. And this theory inspired a very distinguished painter, Seurat. But it was too remote from the first spontaneous delight in nature, upon which, in the end, all landscape painting must depend. Monet, the original unswerving Impressionist, when he found that straightforward naturalism was exhausted, attempted a kind of color symbolism to express changing effects of light. Finally, he turned to the water-lily garden which he had made in his grounds. The enraptured contemplation of the clouds reflected in its surface was the subject of his last great masterpiece. He conceived it in one continuous form, like a symphonic poem. It takes its point of departure from experience, but the stream of sensation becomes a stream of consciousness. But how does the consciousness become paint? That is the miracle. By a knowledge of each effect so complete that it becomes instinctive, and every movement of the brush is not only a record, but a self-revealing gesture. Total immersion. This is the ultimate reason why the love of nature has been for so long accepted as a religion. It is a means by which we can lose our identity in the whole and gain thereby a more intense consciousness of being. I feel, therefore I am.